everyone. Thank you very much for attending the conference. So yesterday we heard a very interesting paper about the Chagos Islands from Khushbu Mangru. She talked about the Chagos Islands in the context of the creation of the British Indian Ocean Territory. And today we're going to hear another paper about the Chagos Islands from a different perspective. It's entitled From Brexit to the Chagos Archipelago. It's going to be presented by Dr. Alicia Mornington, who is a senior lecturer at Paris 1 Panthéon-Sorbonne University. She has held various visiting research positions, including at Oxford University, LSE, and Columbia. She also teaches at Sciences Po, and her research focuses mainly on political and legal theory, in particular liberal thought, and the question of paternalism. So, Alicia, over to you.
Thank you very much, Elias, for this introduction, and thank you all for this conference. It's extremely interesting. So I'm going to share my slides. Can you see my screen? Is this working? Yeah. Whoops, sorry. Sorry. Okay, so before I start, a disclaimer. I sincerely apologize, but there's going to be a lot of repetition from what has been said yesterday by the tremendous presentation that we heard on the Chagos Island and Archipelago, and also there's going to be a lot of echoes with things that some of you have mentioned earlier on. So, okay, so to start off, the Chagos Archipelago is a little known case of ongoing decolonization. It's situated in the midst of the Indian Ocean, and it's still to free itself from colonial rule. In the context of Brexit, the Chagos situation may appear to be somewhat of a contradiction. When it came to leaving the EU, the resounding motto that we all heard from the Leave campaign was to reclaim sovereignty, to take back control. The EU was portrayed as an impinging supranational power, violating British consent and the self-determination of British people. Yet when it comes to Chagos, the framework does not seem to apply in the same way. And the UK has tried to counter the narrative of self-determination in every possible way, as we will see it. In international law, the notion of consent of the governed is as a ground for legitimacy is found in the idea of self-determination. In the context of decolonization, self-determination has been used as a rallying cry for independence all across the British Empire. And Brexiters strikingly echoed this plea, and voters accepted Brexit as a quest for self-determination, which is why the parallel is, I believe, entirely justified. So this presentation seeks to draw a parallel between the use of the two uses of this concept in the UK's choice to maintain its claim on the Chagos and in light of Brexit. The goal of this analysis is not to simply say that it is a case of double standards. It is rather to understand what has made it possible for self-determination to operate successfully as a normative concept in the case of Brexit, and what are the reasons for it to operate in a less convincing way in the case of Chagos, although the situation, as we will see, is evolving. So this is an aerial view of Diego Garcia, the largest island of the Chagos, and the contested one. So 3 points to this presentation. First, I'm going to present the situation, a situation characterized by displaced people whose land was sold and then loaned. Second, we will look at the I won't go into a lot of detail because this is what we've heard yesterday in part. And third, we'll look at self-determination and compare the situation with Brexit. Okay, so to first explain the historical situation, The archipelago stretches for more than 350 kilometers in the middle of the Indian Ocean, and it is composed of 7 atolls and more than 60 islands, with a total land area of 64 square kilometers. But as home to the Chagosians, a Bourbonnais Creole speaking people. The strategic location of Chagos is what has made it so attractive to colonial powers. It would prove central to trade and to Western powers. So originally an uninhabited archipelago, it was discovered, inverted commas, by the Portuguese in 1512 and later became Dutch and then French. Under French rule, African slaves were sent to work on plantations there. The UK took possession of the Chagos at the end of the Napoleonic Wars and still controls it to this day. During the Cold War, the Indian Ocean became strategic as part of the strategy of containment of communism. The Vietnam War, triggered by the US's need for a maritime base in the Indian Ocean from where to conduct military operations, made this area absolutely key. And Diego Garcia, the largest island, was selected as the ideal location. It allowed for access to Southeast Asia, but was also ideally situated, specifically because it's close to the Hormuz Strait, a global trade route. So what happened was a double bilateral agreement, which makes the situation quite specific. So first, there was not an agreement between the US and the UK. Secret talks were held between the two powers in 1966. And a secret agreement was passed, which did not go through British Parliament. The US is reported to have paid $40 million for the archipelago as part of a 50-year loan, which was extended for a further 20 years, which means it wouldn't return to the UK before 2036. The US built a military base there in 71, which became operational in 86 and was used in the post 9/11 context as a launch pad for both the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq. The US has described it as an indispensable military base. Second, the UK passed an agreement with Mauritius. So apparently, Mauritius claims that the UK argued that it wouldn't be allowed to become independent unless it sold the Chagos archipelago, which it did. Mauritius then claimed that its consent was in fact expressed under duress. It had been forced to sell, and in fact disputed this agreement. At the end of the day, the archipelago was severed from Mauritius and the Seychelles when it gained independence in exchange of a lump sum of £4 million, and it became known as the BIOT, the British Indian Ocean Territory. The third central element of this case is the exile of the Chagosians, who were evicted from their homeland from between 1967 and 73 to allow the US to build the military base. So there was a little over 2,000 people who were exiled. Sometimes families were split up, with some of them being sent to Mauritius, others to the Seychelles, and many found their ways in the UK, where they were granted British passports. From this situation has emerged, this situation has led to a series of legal battles. So declared an overseas territories, the Chagos has always been claimed as the sovereign land of the UK, despite growing contestation. This contestation takes two different shapes, which is again quite specific. There's the first claim coming from the Chagosians themselves as individuals who claim the right of return. And there's the second claim from Mauritius that claims territorial sovereignty. So I will not go into the detail of all of these cases because we've heard quite a lot of that yesterday, but there was a first case in the European Court of Human Rights that ruled against the Chagosians by saying that they had received compensation for their loss, and therefore their claim was not valid. A first major diplomatic blow to the UK came in 2017 with the United Nations General Assembly resolution to send the matter to the ICJ. The ICJ in 2019 declared that, in fact, the occupation of Chagos by the UK was illegal, and that the archipelago should be returned as rapidly as possible. Further on in 2019, a further diplomatic blow with a resolution which reads as the following. So the General Assembly demands that the UK withdraws its colonial administration from the Chagos archipelago unconditionally, urges in facilitating the resettlements of Mauritian nationals, including those of Chagosian origins, in the Chagos archipelago. So the right of self-determination and the right of return has been affirmed by the UN. Further developments earlier on this year with ITLOS ruling again that the UK was not acting legally, but the UK said it would contest the decision. Basically, the UK has tried every possible way of maintaining its hold on the archipelago. One strategy has been to use environmental issues. So in 2010, it created the Chagos Marine Protected Area. It was a controversial decision, and it was notably passed when Parliament was in recess. So from the beginning of this matter, Parliament has not been consulted, basically. The strategy backfired as the Permanent Court of Arbitration unanimously held in 2015 that the Marine Protected Area, which the UK had declared, was created in violation of international law. More embarrassingly for the UK, WikiLeaks revealed in 2010 that the UK had intentionally meant to use environmental conservation as a ploy to prevent Chagosians from returning to their homeland. So in other words, the UK is playing every possible card in their hand in order to keep the precious atolls. The sad irony is that available evidence tends to show, in fact, widespread pollution to maritime resources on Diego Garcia due to the military base's activities. Okay, so if we look at the concept of self-determination in international law, we see that it is quite a subtle and complex notion. It's central. So to define it, it is a concept which grants people the right to choose over their own destiny. It finds its intellectual roots in the classical liberal philosophy of John Locke, for example, who developed the idea that the consent of the governed represents the sole basis for the legitimacy of the state. In international law, it's a central principle. So it, of course, it's mentioned in the Atlantic Charter. It has been progressively recognized as a general principle of law and enshrined in a number of international treaties. So if ending colonial rule was not part of the original goals of the UN, when the General Assembly adopted its 1960 Declaration on the granting of independence to colonial countries and peoples, the concept of self-determination was emphasized. But it's a concept that comes with many ambiguities. If it has been accepted as a core principle, its application is far from, let's say, it's far from being perfectly coherent. So it was initially defined to weaken by activating nation-state demands and then reactivated in respect to decolonization. But in practice, it's a principle which holds little normative value on its own. International law is indeed the product of the balance of powers and reflects the interest of dominant powers, and as such comes into contradiction with popular demands. In practice, international law shows that the right of self-determination is recognized a posteriori, and double standards apply quite obviously. So, for example, you have the case of Biafra, but there are so many other cases that some of you have mentioned. So I think we can all agree on this point. In British law, interestingly, self-determination is also valued. So obviously in the case of referenda and Brexit, but it's also part of overseas territories' constitutions. For example, the Falkland Island constitutions and the Gibraltar Constitution both mention the right to self-determine. Okay, so this takes me to my last point. Why was self-determination so successful in the case of Brexit, and why was it not in the case of Chagos? So in the case of Brexit, there's the simplicity of self-determination. Brexit successfully used the classic liberal framework to describe the EU as a despotic power encroaching on British freedom. So the take back control motto I've already mentioned was simple, efficient. It enabled Brexiters to use self-determination as a weapon and, in a sense, to use a pillar of the logic of decolonization against the EU. So instead of arguing against the EU because it was a complex administrative body, or to mention complicated issues regarding fishing rights, for example, the Leave rhetoric was built on building an instinctual gut reaction, gut response on fighting against what was described as a colonial power. It sacralized Brexit by depicting it as a noble fight against a colonial and centralized Brussels-based power. So classical liberalism is a theory seeking to denounce illegitimate political authority. It opposes individuals to the state. So, as already mentioned, John Locke, the father of classical liberalism, defends the idea that political power is only legitimate when it's backed by individual consent. And we see this rationale in several of these quotes here. So Boris Johnson, for example, claimed, "It is we, the Leave camp, not they, who stand in the tradition of the liberal cosmopolitan European Enlightenment. They're fighting for an outdated absolutist ideology, and we're fighting for freedom." Nigel Farage, for example, declared, "Parliament is reduced to the level of a large council. No one knows for sure exactly how much of our law comes from Brussels, could be 70 or 80%. So if this is obviously factually true, the ambiguity, the imposition is what makes it more worrying. Boris Johnson also declared the following: "What was once the EEC has undergone a spectacular metamorphosis in the last 30 years, and the crucial point is that it is still becoming even more centralizing, interfering and anti-democratic. The independence of this country is being seriously compromised. It is this fundamental democratic problem, the erosion of democracy, that brings me to the fight." Okay, so we see this logic in several speeches. In the case of the Chagos, we have a radically different understanding of the concept. So the UK was asked by the UN to react to the condemnation, and this is what the United Kingdom declared in its defense for the situation. So you have this on the slide. So it first claimed that the Chagos Archipelago has always been under British rule, basically since 1840, and that Mauritius representative freely accepted. So this is a case of consent. Mauritius consented, and this consent was valid, and they were paid. They were paid in exchange for this compensation. And a fundamental principle of international law and the international legal order is that of consent. So the UK describes the current situation as a voluntary pact between two nations. And moreover, it put forward later on arguments concerning the safety of the region. So it's the important role the facility plays in maintaining regional and global peace and security. And it also mentioned, so that's in 2020, although it had already been condemned in 2015, but it still it's still advocating for the idea that it is helping to protect the marine protected area, although this is not the case. So how can we interpret this? A realist hypothesis would say the following. There are very few advocates for the Chagosian cause. Jeremy Corbyn is one of them. The Conservative MP for Crawley, where there are a lot of Chagosians who live in exile, is one of them, but there are very few people who are advocating for and making this cause visible. There's also a small number of victims as opposed to other situations of displaced people. There's limited campaigning, and with a few exceptions, and they're facing the US, the largest, most powerful economy in the world. Moreover, it's quite a complex case because it is involving 4 different parties. It's not a simple situation where you have a colonial power occupying a country with a people fighting for their independence. It's a question of displacement. It's a question of loaning one country to another. So the contractual element, the fact that Mauritius did accept factually to sell part of its own territory, makes it more complicated. So there's the reparation hypothesis as to what should be done about the situation. So following the court cases, a £40 million fund has been agreed upon by the UK, but it turns out that in 2020, only £12,000 of this package has been in fact spent to support the Chagosians. So even on the notions of reparation, the UK attitude is quite striking. The UK agreed on planned visits because until quite recently, 2006, Chagosians did not have the right to return simply to visit the atolls, and there were planned visits, but only a week per year is allowed. There was further reports of the press concerning Windrush scandals, as Chagosians living in the UK are increasingly being asked to leave, and although they have nowhere to return to. So as a conclusion, we could ask ourselves, what is going to happen to Chagos in 2036? Is the loan going to be extended from the UK to the US? Are reparations going to increase? There does seem to be a growing international contestation of this case, and the UK is increasingly isolated on the world stage regarding this issue. Are Chagosians going to be allowed to resettle on a military base? Are they going to be reattached to Mauritius? It's quite worrying because when Chagosians were in fact living under Mauritian rule in Mauritius after having been exiled, there's widespread evidence of discrimination. So if Chagosians were allowed to resettle and to live in the Mauritian, Mauritian is the Chagos, if the Chagos are part of Mauritius, it's not that obvious that they would be allowed self-rule and self-determination. So that is also quite unclear. Would Mauritius be able to protect their right to self-rule is yet to be established. And the area is more strategic than ever, with the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative focusing on this area as well. So it's quite unlikely that the UK is going to let go of this area. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alicia, for a very interesting presentation. I think that the Chagos Islands haven't been talked about enough. Maybe that's also the case for Wales in a way. In the previous panel, we've talked about Scotland. In the next panel, we're going to talk about Northern Ireland. And so now we're going to listen to a presentation entitled Wales and Self-Determination in the 2020s. It's going to be presented by Dr. Adrien, who is a senior lecturer in British and Commonwealth Studies at the University of Versailles. His research mainly covers post-colonial nation building and international relations in Commonwealth member states in the Pacific. But he's going to talk about Wales right now. So over to you, Adrien.
Thank you, Elias. Alicia, could you just remove your PowerPoint because I can't open mine. Thank you. Right, let's see if I can get that working then. There, does that appear? Yeah, okay, good, thanks. All right, so mindful of the time constraints, I'm going to skip over the details of historical background for now, but I can of course come back to them later on if you wish. So I'll just dive straight in and begin with the issue of Brexit in Wales and its consequences. Now, as you probably all recall, the Welsh voted in favour of the United Kingdom leaving the European Union by about 52%, which puzzled a number of commentators, partly, of course, because the Welsh people appeared to be voting against their own economic interests, Wales being a net recipient of EU funds, unlike England. And there's also the fact that the Welsh vote sort of muddied the image of Brexit as being an English decision imposed upon the Celtic peripheries. And there's an interesting example of that in an article in The Guardian from 2019, which seemed to try to bring the Welsh vote back into that slightly simpler narrative. And that article was titled, "English People Living in Wales Tilted It Towards Brexit, Research Finds." And that paper quotes Oxford geographer Danny Dorling, who claims, the quote should be on the screen normally, if I'm using this PowerPoint incorrectly. Yes, or not. Does it appear or not, or am I still on the previous page?
Yeah, we see the quote, yes.
Yeah, okay, right, thanks. Right, where am I? Yeah, so he says, as you can see, if you look at the more genuinely Welsh areas, especially the Welsh-speaking ones, they did not want to leave the EU. Wales was made to look like a Brexit-supporting nation by its English settlers. The Welsh did not want to quit the EU. It is those southern English voters that are dragging Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland unwillingly out of Europe. Now, that, of course, is an unprovable claim, and it served mainly, it seems to me, to satisfy certain assumptions, tying them in neatly with a narrative of a disempowered Wales subjected by its larger English neighbour, and even perhaps by the effects of colonialism, if you note the use of the words English settlers. But it also, I think, unconsciously raises interesting questions as to whom the Welsh nation comprises, and therefore whom or may not legitimately exercise self-determination for Wales. And that brings us back to issues that Stuart was mentioning in his keynote presentation this morning, and with that quote from Jennings, and that the people cannot decide until someone decides who the people are. Now, Dorling's claims have been at least partly refuted by more in-depth studies. For example, researchers from Cardiff and Edinburgh universities crossed data regarding national self-identification and the 2016 vote in the referendum. And they found, as you can see here, that yes, English-born residents who live in Wales, but who have not integrated into a Welsh nor even a broader British identity. So, English-born residents who live in Wales, but who see themselves simply as English, did generally favour Brexit. Right? That is true. But at the same time, many English-born Welshmen and Welshwomen are comfortable with multiple identities, and they generally did not vote in favour of Brexit, contrary to a large majority of their Welsh-born compatriots viewing themselves as more British than Welsh. Right? So if you were born in England, living in Wales, in general, in fact, you did not vote for Brexit. If you were born in Wales, but you see yourself as more British than Welsh, you generally did vote for Brexit. Okay. So in other words, it's perfectly possible for immigrants to have integrated into Wales, just as it's possible for Welsh-born Welsh people to feel predominantly British, attached to the Union, mindful of its future as a whole, while also being and feeling Welsh. So Welsh nationhood, perhaps inextricably interrelated with the rest of the United Kingdom, is in fact far more complex, far more multifaceted than any definitions of the so-called genuinely Welsh. I would point out also that other researchers have found that social class and socioeconomic status appear to have been primary conditioning factors in the referendum, with impoverished working class Welsh voters responding in near identical ways to fellow British workers, for example, in the north of England. So from that perspective, the Brexit vote appears more as a class-based rejection of post-industrial globalized economics of the shrinking state, okay, rather than issues of sub-state nationality. Now, such realities notwithstanding, Brexit did spur Welsh nationalists towards campaigning more actively for Welsh independence. It gave rise, for instance, to increasingly large rallies by a grassroots, non-partisan pro-independence group called Yes Cymru. And if we look at opinion polls, while polls in 2014 and 2015 were finding that support for Welsh independence was in the single figures, polls over the last couple of years have reported numbers between 24 and 32% in favour of independence. And a poll a couple of years ago, a poll in April 2019, asked the more specific question of whether respondents would vote in favour of independence for Wales if it would allow Wales to rejoin the European Union. And in that hypothesis, support for independence rose to 39%, with actually a majority of young people, 58% of under 35-year-olds, in favour of independence in that case. Now, obviously, this remains well short of a majority of the Welsh electorate, and we can see that most Welsh people still would not support independence in any circumstance. But this sharp rise in the figures has changed Welsh political discourses on the topic, and that's what I would like to look at now. I'll start by looking at the position of Plaid Cymru before also a little bit about how the Welsh Labour Party positions itself on these issues. Now, Plaid Cymru had formally clarified back in 2001 that independence was not on the cards, that independence was not even a long-term goal for the party. That has now changed because Plaid Cymru's party conference this year in February 2021 officially endorsed, including in its manifesto for the Senate election in May, a promise to hold an independence referendum within the first term of government in the admittedly unlikely event of Plaid Cymru securing a majority in the Senate in May. So that made the Welsh election last month, the first in which citizens would be able to vote in favour of holding an independence referendum. Prior to that conference of the party, so prior to formally deciding that they would offer independence in the Senedd election, Plaid Cymru had commissioned a report on the practical feasibility of independence. Now, that report, which was encouragingly titled Towards an Independent Wales, was published last September 2020. Now, its authors are very cautious in their formulations. I think that they're trying to make sure that they can't be accused of idealism or excessive optimism. So, for example, the authors of that report concede that an independent Wales would remain commercially interconnected with England and therefore commercially dependent on England for the foreseeable future. They point out that if Wales would become a member of the European Union, the entirely open Anglo-Welsh border would become an EU external border, which would cause unthinkable disruption to essential trade and also to the lives of border communities, which echoes of it made a little bit earlier this afternoon regarding the prospect of a hard border between England and Scotland. So, in other words, the future of Wales can only be planned through careful consideration of its inescapably close relationship with England. And indeed, the authors of that report commissioned by Plaid Cymru acknowledged that Wales, I quote, would find it impossible not to be part of a UK single market. Would find it impossible not to be part of a UK single market. So, in a world of practical realities, it would simply not be in the interests of the Welsh people to try to extricate themselves from their economic interconnectedness with England. Now, that being the case, and that being broadly recognised, the question for independence campaigners becomes, how do you secure a meaningful independence in those circumstances? And so, in that regard, the authors of the report returned to an idea which actually had been floated by Plaid Cymru's MP Gunther Evans half a century ago, and they suggested that what they called the countries of Britain should consider, I quote, pooling aspects of their sovereignty in a confederal relationship. Pooling aspects of their sovereignty in a confederal relationship. And the authors argue that this would in fact make Wales a sovereign state with its own seat in the United Nations, because they say the confederation would be defined by, you can see the quote on the screen, it would be defined by independent sovereign nations voluntarily agreeing to delegate certain functions to a central authority, not by means of a constitution, but by a treaty. And that's the difference, of course, between one unified state and different sovereign states, with a process for unilateral withdrawal built into it. The more specific proposal, I won't go into all the details, but simply the key points of what they're proposing is that there should be what they call a League of the Isles. This league would be headed formally by the British monarch. There would be an elected Council of the Isles. That would be a confederal legislative body. And just like in the current Westminster model, that confederal legislative body would include an executive, and that executive would be composed of, I quote, a prime minister and ministers responsible for defense, foreign policy, internal trade, currency, macroeconomic policy, and Isle-wide affairs. So in this model, each of the four nations would have its own parliament, of course. The parliament of each nation would be empowered to object or to suggest amendments to confederal bills. The the parliament of each nation would be sovereign, in the sense that it would be able to legislate on every issue which is not identified as being in the remit of the Confederal Council. And each nation, of course, would have its own, would retain its own first minister. Now, in the view of the authors of this report, and in the view of the leaders of Plaid Cymru, such a confederation would not contradict the sovereignty of Wales, because Wales would be pooling parts of its sovereignty voluntarily with the other British nations on issues such as defence and currency. And of course, this confederal model would give to the Welsh Parliament and to the Welsh First Minister, the Welsh government, a significantly greater say on British defence policy or British monetary policy, for example, than what the 40 MPs of Wales at Westminster presently have. Now, the Welsh election last month saw the Welsh people vote against the proposal for an independence referendum, in the sense that Plaid Cymru was a long way from winning the election. Plaid Cymru's share of the vote remained steady at just over 20.5%. And Plaid obtained fewer than half as many seats as the Labour Party. Now, Plaid's leader, Adam Price, naturally confessed he was disappointed, but he claimed credit for having, he said, having pushed the Labour Party towards advocating constitutional reform. And so in the few minutes I have left, I'd just like to say a little bit about how Welsh Labour positions itself on these issues. Now, Welsh First Ministers, the current First Minister, Mark Drakeford, and his predecessor, Carwyn Jones, are unionists. And as unionists, they've been making the case for what Carwyn Jones back in 2017 called a major constitutional reconstruction of the United Kingdom, with the idea that this would go some way towards Plaid Cymru's proposals, but it would at the same time maintain the United Kingdom as such. It would maintain the union as such. Now, in recent years, so that is prior to last month's election and prior to the election campaign, in recent years, Mark Drakeford was asking simply for a clear, explicit legal recognition of the permanence of the Welsh Parliament, the Welsh Senedd, insofar, of course, as the Welsh people wish to retain it. So, in other words, a guarantee that the devolution could not be unilaterally cancelled by the British Parliament. Now, the 2017 Wales Act, adopted by the British Parliament, actually provides precisely that. Okay? It provides that the Welsh Parliament and devolution cannot be abolished without the consent of the Welsh people. But Mark Drakeford argued that this guarantee needed to be entrenched, and that was what he used. It needed to be entrenched through some form or other of constitutional settlement, which would place it beyond the capacity of a majority in the British Parliament to overturn. Okay, it's that old issue of the sovereignty of the British Parliament, right? Because although it's true that the Wales Act provides that guarantee, as the British Parliament cannot bind itself, the British Parliament could, in principle, easily repeal the Wales Act and then go on to removing Welsh devolution, in principle. Now, if you had this entrenchment, if you had some form of entrenchment, that, of course, would diminish the absolute sovereignty of the Westminster Parliament. Okay? And it would entail recognizing British sovereignty as being, and here again I'm quoting Drakeford, dispersed between the constituent parts of the United Kingdom. Okay, he would like a recognition that sovereignty is dispersed between the constituent parts of the United Kingdom. In his view, this would in fact provide self-determination to the people of Wales through their voluntary choice to remain part of the United Kingdom, and to exercise the delegated measure of the UK sovereignty. Okay? And therefore, from his perspective as a unionist, it would demonstrate the easy compatibility between the Welsh people's Welsh and broader British identities. To me, it seems that Mark Drakeford's proposal was striking in the sense that, on the one hand, its practical effects might actually seem minimal, because on the face of it, it wouldn't provide the Senedd or the Welsh government with any new powers. It wouldn't give them any guaranteed say on matters pertaining to sovereignty, such as defense or foreign affairs. And yet, at the same time, the theoretical implications of that proposal, the symbolic implications of that proposal, are bold to the point of making it highly unlikely to be accepted, okay, in the sense that it strikes, at least symbolically, it strikes at the absolute sovereignty of the British Parliament. Now, for last month's election, the finalised manifesto of the Welsh Labour Party actually went further, a little further than that, because Welsh Labour's manifesto advocated federalism of a form that was not determined in the manifesto, but that would need to be determined by some standing commission. That's what Welsh Labour proposed. Now, in either case, whether we're talking simply about an entrenchment of the union or we're talking about some sort of still nebulous transition to federalism, doing away with the exclusive sovereignty of the British Parliament, which is so often described as the core of the British Constitution, is not likely to be embraced in the near future by the British Parliament. And more generally, I would say simply that the British government has little reason to consider proposals from Welsh leaders and to fundamentally alter the basic principles of the UK's constitution, so long as those proposals are not clearly supported even by a majority of the Welsh people themselves. So to conclude, in conclusion, although Brexit has increased the level of support for Welsh independence, not least by mobilizing young, predominantly young pro-European citizens, a very large majority of the Welsh people, of Welsh citizens, remain content with devolution and unpersuaded by the sovereignty. So while politicians and scholars debate the forms which self-determination might take, most of the Welsh people seem to consider that Wales has exercised self-determination already about as far as they currently wish to take it. Now, this was demonstrated in the May 2021 Welsh election, the outcome of which enabled Labour to govern alone, while Plaid Cymru ended up in third place behind the Conservative Party. So there is overwhelming recognition that Wales is very much a nation, but also that it presently has no realistic prospect of exercising full independence without a sharp decline in precisely what most Welsh people are attached to, namely well-funded, equitable public and social services. So if self-determination aims to ensure a capacity for the Welsh to implement the value-based policies of their choice, and there is a lot of talk, as you know, about the value differences, the difference in ethos between Wales and England, then if that's the aim, then separatism would appear to a large extent self-defeating in that regard. Nor do most Welsh, and I'll finish with this, nor do most Welsh people regard Welshness and Britishness as being incompatible modes of national sentiment. Most identify with both. Most Welsh people identify with both. And nor do they wish to renounce therefore their attachment to British nationhood. So Welsh nationalists recognize this. And so Welsh nationalists frame independence not in very sharp absolute terms. They frame independence in terms of close-knit, voluntary, international cooperation with the rest of Britain and with Europe. But these proposals, whether it's proposals for pooled sovereignty, whether it's proposals for federation, whether it's proposals for confederation, all founder really on the supreme obstacle of currently a lack of grassroots and political support. And I'll end it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Adrien, for a very interesting presentation. So we're going to go for questions now. So if anyone has a question, can you please just unmute your microphone and speak? I guess that's the easiest way to do it. Does anyone have any questions to start with? No? Okay, so I'll ask a few questions first about, oh, sorry, yeah, go on, sorry.
Hello?
Me?
Sorry, okay, I'm just, it's just a question about, I keep reading about the Celtic nations, and although it's quite coming together and forming a confederacy, or perhaps not confederacy, but an alliance. So I just wonder if that's part of your research as well, or
what the Celtic aspects? Right, Plaid Cymru is very similar in a way to the Scottish National Party, in the sense that Plaid Cymru conceives of Welshness and of the Welsh identity in civic and very inclusive terms. And that's also the case for the Yes Cymru movement, which is a very recent movement, which it's a grassroots campaign movement, not aligned with Plaid Cymru, although they have a lot in common. Grassroots campaign movement to mobilize people for independence. And Plaid Cymru, Yes Cymru has also made it very clear that their definition of what the Welsh nation is a very, very broad one. So they have in common with Plaid Cymru the idea that Welshness is, on the one hand, it's the fact that the Welsh nation can refer back to a long history, that this history is distinct from the history of England, that the territory of Wales, co-determined with this history, can be traced back a long time into the past, but that Wales today is also the product of the contributions of all the people who have chosen to make Wales their home, whether it be English people who moved there in the 19th century, or whether it be much more recent migrants who have built a multicultural Wales. So the basic idea is that there are, if you like, Celtic cultural roots to Welsh nationhood, in the sense that the Welsh language has always been fundamental for Plaid Cymru, and they would like an independent Wales to promote the language. They would like to make it open for everyone. That's a point actually that's made in the report that they commissioned, that the Welsh language is a national treasure of the Welsh nation, and that therefore it should be opened for everyone to learn without obligation. Right? You don't have to speak Welsh, you don't have to learn Welsh to be Welsh, but everyone should have the opportunity of learning that language. And I think that pretty much encompasses their approach to what it means to be Wales. Right? If you choose to make Wales your home, never mind how you see yourself, you're welcome and you're Welsh.
Okay, we have another question from Professor Ward.
Yeah, thanks. I'll just stick on the theme of Wales, which I thought that was really fascinating, Adrien, what you've presented. It seems to me that in both Scotland and Wales, what's partly sort of what lies beneath this surge of support for what seems to be a form of national separatism has become bound up in another phenomenon, that is the appeal to voters of what we here in Denmark call nærdemokrati, which I would just literally translate as near democracy, having democracy close. It's not the same as local government. I wouldn't translate it as local government. That is to say, the idea that big central government is remote, it's distant, it's impersonal, and it's indifferent. And it was interesting how you mentioned, was it Carwyn Jones who says that the biggest achievement of Plaid in the last 20 years has been the way they've got the major parties, somehow co-opted them to the program, and that's exactly what's happened in Scotland as well. All the eyes are on the SNP and on Plaid Cymru, but I think if you want to get the crystal ball out and start thinking about how things are going to pan out in the next 10 years, I think we have to look at the way in which the major parties have themselves they've turned into non-unionist parties. They're actually at pains not to seem unionist. They're at pains to signal how they diverge from their English counterparts, particularly in Scotland, where the Tories at the last election, they wouldn't even have Boris Johnson turn up. You could get no more sort of evident sort of indication that there's something not right there, and this is where I think where the axe is going to be wielded. If Britain's going to end, it wouldn't surprise me if the chief instrument are wielded by Labour and/or Tories, despite themselves, perhaps unwittingly, by incrementally going along with a project that leads them ultimately to something that's no longer sustainable or tenable. One of the reasons why I think these federal, there's a lot of talk about federal solutions. I mean, let's be clear. A polity that has somewhere around 50%, we saw in the graph earlier in the case of Scotland, and in the case of Wales, 20%. There's that larger proportion of the polity wants to be another polity. I mean, that's just not tenable. If you're running a tennis club and 20% or 50% of your members want to be part of another club, that is beyond untenable. And so I think that major parties are going to keep chasing that. They're going to keep pursuing that, trying to rein that back somehow, by way of concessions that'll only make it worse. And worse in two ways, I think. That if you end up with a federal system in the United Kingdom, firstly, it's going to be a federal union of divergence rather than convergence. That is to say, most successful federations in modern history have been federations that have been built on singular entities that have already achieved a certain amount of integrity, whether that be political, whether that be cultural, who then choose to converge, who federate up, if you like, to form something. And Australia is, of course, a good example of that. I can give many other good examples. There's not too many good examples of federation, unitary states that then try and federate. And I think that was even in the Kilbrandon report back in the 1970s. That problem was one of the reasons Kilbrandon didn't choose federation. The other problem of a United Kingdom federal union will be, it'll very quickly become apparent that you have terrible imbalance between the component parts, and the elephant in the room, of course, being England. So unless you can get England to break up into half a dozen constituent parts, that concession that Labour or the Tories or even the Liberal Democrats might make to something in the way of a federal union, it's not going to last. So that's my little crystal ball prediction. But I just wonder, I just want to emphasise that I think you're really onto something in looking at Labour actually in Wales as the party that's moving in ways that I think has taken a lot of us, certainly myself, by surprise, which is why I thought it was very interesting to hear what you had to say.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree completely. I mean, one thing that struck me when I was looking at the proposals made by both of these parties is that the proposals actually have a lot in common, but they're presented in different ways. So you have this notion of a pooling of sovereignty coming both from Plaid and from their advisors and from the Labour Party. But on the side of Plaid says, all right, if we pool sovereignty, it means we are a sovereign state who's simply choosing to delegate part of its sovereignty. And you have Labour that says, right, this pooling of sovereignty doesn't change the fact that we are still a union. It doesn't change the fact that we are still part of one United Kingdom. It's perfectly compatible with unionism, except that, as you say, of course, it fundamentally alters what the union is. So it's just painting veneer of unionism over it. And it is true that also, to come back to what you were saying at the start there, Welsh Labour has a clear interest in differentiating itself as much as possible from the politics of England. The Welsh Labour Party has been doing that for quite a while. I mean, they right from the start of devolution, Welsh Labour was firm on differentiating itself from the politics of Tony Blair, which participates really in that idea that there is a specific Welsh ethos in terms of social policy. And well, another paradox really that on that point, a paradox that we see currently in Wales is that opinion polls tell us that Welsh people tend to have a lot more trust in the Welsh government than in the British government, which, as you say, is seen as distant, remote, out of touch with the interests of the Welsh people. I mean, it's not a surprise, of course, that when the Welsh people finally accepted devolution, it was, you know, after almost a couple of decades of Tory British government that they had not voted for. And yet, at the same time, the turnout in Welsh elections remains significantly lower than the turnout for general elections. And when Welsh people are asked about that, many of them tend to reply that they don't really see the point, that they don't really see what the devolved government is for, that they don't really see what the point is in voting for that local government, which again probably explains why the major parties are really trying to. I haven't looked in detail at the Welsh Conservative Party. That's something I still need to look into, what they're doing in terms of policy. But in the case of Labour, you know, of really insisting on the Welsh specificity of its policies to try to drive home the point that, yes, of course, there is value in participating in Welsh elections, and you do get results, and you do that is the vector for actually applying the policies that Welsh people want more than the British general elections.
So may I speak again? I think the big turning point, the Brexit vote in Wales. I mean, I think most. Okay, what was kind of interesting, perhaps I could frame it this way, is that the committee that Johnson has set up, the Union Unit, he had, I think, Oliver Lewis in there, who was actually part of the Vote Leave campaign. So these two things are not disconnected, and to be fair, I think most of the population of this country, rather like the lockdown kind of rollout, we've been left in a very highly confused state. So I think the point I want to make, Wales, it's just been published that they've got the highest number of children in care. They're constantly told that they've got one of the worst poverty rates in Europe. So we know that childcare and so on is these kind of poverty and children going into care are not unrelated. And efforts by Wales to assert itself economically are constantly thwarted by Westminster. So it's perhaps not they want medical marijuana, which is $1 billion business internationally. They can grow it themselves. They've got the wind farm off North Wales. They've got the Prince and Princess of Wales title, which if they went independent, then what is England going to do about that? You've also got a Yes England movement in the north that is really, really, I think a lot of people are at the end of their tether with the power base and the domination and the campaign with union flags and these union units that, to maintain dominance and control at all costs. There's also another issue on languages and identity and values, which are not represented by a dominant language coming out of Westminster, out of England. So there are, Wales had its own legal systems, that there are all these cultural nuances that are embedded in these Celtic nations' languages. the Celtic nations also extend to France. So I think those are just, sorry, some observations that I think the post-lockdown period where Wales has managed itself, many people would say better than England. It's just shown a lot of the nation how neglected and almost there's an element of abuse going on as well, I would say. And you know, culturally, Boris Johnson has now instructed his party not to talk about Wales as an independent country. So that was in the Commons 2 days ago when he was talking about the home nations in sport. So it's quite insidious, this little kind of almost bullying campaign coming out of Westminster and out of the cabinet. And I think many Welsh people, many young people, they can see that it's just glaring. So if England wants the union to continue, this kind of, you know, this insidious and disingenuous kind of tactics, they really need to sort themselves out. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just reply briefly on one point. What you're saying about neglect and the including the economic aspect of the relationship, that echoes something that Welsh nationalists have been saying for a while, partly in response to the point that, or the very strong risk that, no, the point really that the Welsh economy would not be self-sustaining in isolation. One of the responses from Welsh nationalists has been to say, well, we can't really know because we're locked into a relationship that is, as you've said, dominant, that is exploitative. There are members of Plaid who have even referred to it as a colonialist or quasi-colonialist relationship, in the sense that they see the English as expropriating Welsh resources for the interests of other parts of the United Kingdom. And so the claim from Welsh nationalists, which I don't find fully persuasive, but it's their claim, is to say, if we had independence, we would have all the tools, we would have all the fiscal tools, all the economic tools to make sure that our economic policies would be geared towards our own interests, our own priorities, instead of being locked into an economic system that is predominantly to the advantage of the conservative voting south of England. Now, the fact remains nonetheless that, as I was saying, the Welsh economy, and even supporters of independence concede this. The authors of the report that was published for Plaid a few months ago concede this very, very explicitly. The Welsh economy cannot, in the near or middle future, in the conceivable future, be conceived other than through its relationship with the rest of the United Kingdom. And that does remain a very major obstacle. Tomas has had his hand up for quite a while, I don't know.
Yeah. So yeah, you can go next.
Thank you. Just a quick question from someone who has been working mostly on the first half of the 20th century. An interesting aspect that struck me is that perhaps due to the impact and role of the mining sector and heavy industry in the first half of the 20th century, being a politician and holding a seat in Wales was no guarantee of success in politics, but of course allowed you to achieve success in many cases. And there was a string of highly influential ministers and some prime ministers who had been elected in Wales. And it seems to me that this is no longer be as true as it used to be in the past 20 or 30 years. And I do wonder whether the fact that at the moment we seem to have, by and large, fewer heavyweights in Westminster coming from Wales or being elected in Wales may have any kind of influence on the attitudes of the voters towards the UK in general. Is this something that you believe will come into play in a way or another? or is this a relatively marginal factor which is not going to have any major impact on the debates you've been talking about? Thank you very much.
In terms of individual personalities, that's an interesting point. I mean, as you said, historically, earlier in the 20th century, there were really charismatic, predominant personalities that emerged from Wales in Westminster politics, and whose Welshness was a unionist Welshness. I mean, who was a cultural Welshness that was perfectly compatible with being British, simply fighting Wales's corner within the Union. I mean, of course, what has changed now in the 21st century is that you have the devolved administration, but I can't think of if you look at Labour MPs representing Wales in the House of Commons, I can't think of a predominant figure similar to those that there have been in the 20th century, which is one of the many factors, I think, probably why Wales doesn't attract as much attention. I mean, obviously, there's also the fact that in Scotland, the prospect for independence is much is much stronger, much more real, so that Scotland gets much more attention. But yeah, it's probably a factor as well.
Thank you. If no one else has a question, I might have one for Alicia about the Chagos Islands. I have to say, since I didn't know much about the subject until yesterday, and now I'm fascinated by it, because I think it does concern very few people, but as a symbol, it's very shocking and fascinating. So I was just wondering, what is the dominant feeling amongst the Chagosians who live in the UK, for instance? Because I know the Chagosians in Mauritius want Mauritius to get the islands back, but the Chagosians in the UK there's a strong call for self-determination exist or not. I mean, you said that there were very few demonstrations, but I was just wondering if you knew what the people and I was going to say the descendants, but it's very recent. So the sons and daughters of these people, do these people really want to go back at all costs? I mean, does very few of them care anymore and just want to be British, or what's the feeling? And also about the US, what is the role of the United States in all this? Because they do have the biggest island for a military base. So yeah, I was just wondering.
Thank you very much for your question. It's an excellent question, actually, because a different set of issues, I think. On the one hand, you have a typical territorial claim from Mauritius to the UK, and that's quite a straightforward situation. But when it comes to the Chagosians, it's quite complex. From what I have read and the evidence that I found, their priority is to be able to go back and to live there. And in one of the rulings in the UK, there was a study that was performed by KPMG for the British government, which proved that it was technically feasible to have the Chagosians live there, that it was doable, that they could come back theoretically. And I'm only aware of one group operating in the UK of Chagosians, and they are trying to put forward a plan. And so I've read documents saying they could develop an industry working on several specific agricultural projects, tourism, etc. So they're trying to make a return look realistic and plausible. I'm not entirely sure that it matters to them that this return is under Mauritius power or the UK, because in the document that I've read, they said that they could, for example, be employed on the military base. So they're not contesting the existence of the military base. They just want to go back to their homeland. And there's also the question of having the right to visit graves and abandoned churches there. So it's a very minimal claim, I would say. They're not necessarily, they're not that concerned, I think, from my impression, and they're not in a position really to be asking for more than that, but it's really, they want to have the right to resettle. And I'm not entirely sure this is realistic. I mean, for the US, I'm not aware of any specific type of argument except the argument of security. But given this area has always been strategic, but it keeps becoming more and more important in world politics, especially with the shift towards China and the Belt and Road Initiative, as I mentioned. So I really don't see the US abandoning the military base. Now, would a resettlement be compatible with the operation of this military base? That's another question. And it's not technically impossible from what I found. We'll see.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your answer. Okay, do we have any more questions? I think it's time.
There's one final one. I think there's the hands are not always visible, which is, but Khushbu, yeah.
Yes, thank you. So I just wanted to complete what Alicia just said. So yes, it's true that the majority of them wants to go back, but recently I've had the opportunity to speak to some Chagosians in the UK, and I realized that some of them disagree with the International Court of Justice's verdict. For example, they would like the Chagos Archipelago to remain British, in fact, and not Mauritian. Now, about the US, from what I've read recently, they are in favor of a resettlement, of a Chagosian resettlement, but they would like the sovereignty to remain under the Chagos Archipelago to remain under British sovereignty, and not they don't want a Mauritian sovereignty, for example. So they want to deal with their best Western ally, if I may put it that way. So yes, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think that's fascinating. You have people who are not necessarily asking for self-determination, but just for the right to go back to their land, and maybe not just to live, but just to visit, apparently. So, okay, thank you very much.